Hello and welcome to part two of our webinar series on the tomato brown rugose fruit virus. Yesterday, we had Kara McCreary from OMAFRA sharing the latest in management and preventative practices. If you missed it, there will be a recording made available later this week. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Mike Bledsoe, who is Vice President of Food Safety and Regulatory Affairs at Village Farms. And he's going to be sharing the impacts of the rugose on growers with a particular emphasis on the U.S. federal order introduced last fall. But first, this webinar series would not be possible without the support of our sponsor, DeRuyter, who says, at DeRuyter Seeds, we recognize seed health and the rugose is an important and current concern in our industry. We are delighted to collaborate to bring these webinars to you. DeRuyter, as part of the Vegetable Seeds Division at Bayer, offers seed for protected culture in glasshouse and greenhouse cultivation. We are committed to bringing high-quality seed to your operation and to taking a proactive approach to supplying clean seeds. To bring our commitment to life, we developed SHIELD, Seed Health Innovation Excellence Leadership and Discipline. It is our comprehensive approach to delivering healthy seeds season after season. You can find out more about the SHIELD program on DeRuyter's website. We take great pride in our genetics, we invest in innovation, we strive to produce the best quality seed in the market, and we aim to deliver an excellent growing experience. All of this to work towards a shared goal of filling plates with healthy and nutritious fruits and vegetables to those around the world. To our audience, if you have questions, send them to us as we go along using the questions box to the panel on your right, and we'll address as many as we can during the Q&A period after the presentation. And if your connection cuts out, don't worry, because a recording of this webinar will be made available online and a direct link will be sent to everyone who registered later this week. So without further ado, I will hand the controls over to Mike.
Well, thank you very much. I want to make sure good. Thank you very much. I appreciate Greenhouse Canada for the opportunity to do this, and DeRuyter and Bayer for being our sponsor. I'm glad to get the opportunity to talk to the group. Most of you, I assume, are going to be growers and know about some of the challenges, but I've been fortunate enough to be in the middle of a lot of the planning and all, and we'll try to share what I can today. North American hydroponic tomato growers' perspective and impact from the APHIS federal order on the rugose virus. And I'll be referring to the tomato brown rugose fruit virus as rugose virus most often during presentation because it's a whole lot easier for me to say. The agenda, and this is just, I was told to tell people what I'm going to say it, and tell them again. So here it is. We're going to talk about the federal order briefly on the rugose virus. We're going to talk about why greenhouse, why spend the money on a greenhouse, and why the rugose is critical to greenhouse production. We're going to talk about greenhouse sanitation procedures. And we're going to talk about a new coalition that's been formed of the U.S. Greenhouse Coalition, but it's made up of U.S., Canadian, Mexican growers within and those countries and in the U.S. that have U.S. presence and are the ones that basically market the product in the U.S. as well. And then I'll do a recap of all this. So I appreciate you guys taking time to join us today. And I'm going to repeat several things during it. Bear with me because some of these things are important. I want to make sure they're said and understood. Quick review, worldwide emergence of the rugose. And I took this actually from Dr. Ling, so I haven't gone back through to prove any of it. But in 2014, it was found in Israel and Jordan. In 2018, it was reported in Mexico. Now, again, in 2018, the first report in the U.S. later in the year out of California. Also in 18, it was first reported in Europe, but in 19, Germany, Italy, Turkey, and the UK had their first reports. This particular disease, as you'll learn as we go through it, is both seed-borne and I believe seed transmitted. In other words, you plant it, comes up in the seed as well, at least to some minor amount. And it spread across the world fairly quickly. Asia got it in 2019, China. 2019, APHIS in November 22nd came out with their federal order, which is the impact we're going to be talking a lot about today. And then 2020, significant issues with border inspections between Canada, U.S., and Mexico, U.S. Initially, the inspections were visual. The APHIS, when they put out the first order, sent out some photos of what they thought rugose would look like and how the Customs and Border Patrol, which is the ones that do the inspections at the border, would be able to use it. Unfortunately, rugose looks just like pepino mosaic virus, and it actually, some of the things I'll show you that were turned around don't look anything like what you see up at the top of the screen. They were green tail fruit on TOVs and etc. Immunostrips at some of the borders became part of the program later on, not at first, not for at least the first 50 to 60 days of this, where there was a lot of early activity. Hundreds of rejections. Few Immunostrip presumptive positives during that period of time, and none of them were RNA sequenced. At that period of time, and even now, the Immunostrip was never devised for the tomato brown rugose fruit virus. It was designed for tobacco mosaic virus and tomato mosaic virus, and can weakly react for the rugose virus. But because it was quick and could be done on site, APHIS selected to do that. And you'll find out earlier that they didn't even do it on site. They'd have it sent 3 to 8 days down to the lab where they do Immunostrip using it. Okay, the federal order itself. You can see on November 15th, the USDA APHIS, and that's Animal Plant Health and Inspection Service, announced they're going to be putting out a new order on the rugose virus. It was going to include tomatoes and it was going to include peppers, because those are the two that had been cited before. And it was for the rugose, as I mentioned a minute ago. And so 7 days later, this order came out, which is remarkably fast. To get an order out that fast is, I mean, I'm glad APHIS can move that fast, but that was one of the quickest moves I'd run across anyway. And one of the challenges I'll point later is that it was put out prior to doing a risk assessment, much like Canada did with the CFIA. 3 key areas of this federal order for tomatoes and peppers. They all deal with phytosanitation. The first one is tomato and pepper seeds. They want testing and phytosanitation certificates from the seed companies prior to entering the U.S. The seed companies, I had the honor of being at the American Seed Test Trade Association meetings earlier this year, and they're working really hard to find solutions to make sure this happens. And they've been working very hard to try to present clean seeds to the industry. The second part of this was plant materials ending up in the U.S. Well, that seems interesting until you think about all our propagated materials in the U.S. come from Canadian propagators or some Mexican propagators. There are none in the U.S. for greenhouse. There are for field, but not for the greenhouse that we're currently using. So all the plant material, all the grafted material that comes in would come in from Canada or Mexico. So all those have to have a phytosanitation certificate. And the third and really unique part of this was it's pretty much unheard of to have fruit inspections at the border, but it did come about on this particular order. And with the order happening as fast as it did, without having had the chance to complete their risk assessment, according to most of us, we believe that it was very political at this point and was added on. And I'll go into it a little bit later why I think that happened. So it came out initially, it had a visual inspection, and later they used the tobacco mosaic virus Immunostrips as a weak indicator, but they were using it as confirmation of having the rugose at the borders. So why greenhouse in the first place? I mean, production, it's year-round, it's higher per acre than the field, 20 to 30 times, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. It requires less water, about 13% of what the field tomatoes use per pound of tomato. Food safety, it's a controlled environment. We're fortunate enough, we have the advantage of not having deer walking through at night and birds flying over during the day and too far for workers to get back to a facility, which can happen in some field situations. We have IPM, Integrated Pest Management, not because we're particularly good guys in this industry, but because it works for us. We start off in almost all cases with beneficial insects. Everybody heard about what ladybugs and all that. Well, we have different weeds in the industry, but in this particular case, we start off with it. In fact, the site right below here, you'll see one greenhouse that I have records on showed they spent over $14,000 per acre on beneficials. And that included the bees too, the bumblebees, which is about 6,000 to 7,000 of that. Far less effect from environment, and you get higher yields, higher quality produce, and vine ripe. So that's why a greenhouse. Some numbers on a greenhouse in North America. I got some of these numbers from OGVG and some from other sources. The OGVG, they showed me about 4,300 acres in Canada. I believe 2/3 of those or more in the Leamington area. The other is pretty much over in the west coast of Canada in British Columbia. U.S. has about 2,000 acres, all of which about 300 of that is large scale, and that's growing every day. In fact, there's 100 acres greenhouse opening every couple months now, and so that number may be way behind. And Mexico claims 5,000. A lot of that is high-tech greenhouses, but a lot of it is shade cloth. In Mexico, in the last previous suspension agreement, greenhouse was defined as any shade cloth or anything else that offered some protection to the produce. So that number for high tech, and these are all high tech, could be significantly lower, although I know Mexico does have quite a bit of high tech now. There's a lot of integration between growers in US, Canada, and Mexico, and that's critical. And that's things we've preached over and over again to APHIS. If you're a US grower, you probably have a Canadian facility, or if you're, same thing with some Mexican. I mean, back and forth, very heavily between Canada and US, and significantly high between Mexico and US. By the way, US is the market for fresh market tomatoes. It's at least 64% of all tomatoes produced in North America are sold into the US market. I guess the US citizens have a high appetite for fresh market tomatoes. Wanted to show you why production is those numbers I told you 30 sometimes. If you look at field production, according to USDA, they produce the field 3 to 3.6 kilograms per square meter. Just a number, 30 to 3.6. If you go and look at the small greenhouses, less than 10 acres, which doesn't sound small to most, but it is, they do 30 to 35 kilograms per square meter. If you go to the older style Venlo large-scale greenhouses, 60 to 75, and if you go to the new semi-closed greenhouses, they've done 80 to 114, a world record at one point. So what does that mean? Well, if you use the field as a 1, that means that the small greenhouses could do 10 times what the field does per acre. The old style greenhouse funnel could do 20, and the new can do 30 times per acre. So there is a multiplier when you're dealing with greenhouse production. That's all done with 87% less water per pound of tomato than in an open field. Snapshot, back in 1989, the Canadian greenhouse market had started to develop and was moving along fairly well. But at that time, the fresh market tomatoes in the US, less than 0.5% were of the fresh market tomatoes in retail stores, which at that time were groceries. I don't believe there were any big box, or they were just starting, was a small number. A lot of those were, some were Canadian, some were Dutch. Today, US retail fresh market tomatoes, remember there's processing tomatoes you use in your pizza, your salsas and stuff like that, but I'm talking only fresh market tomatoes. Big difference between the two. Based on Nielsen data and retail data, we're showing that 75% of all fresh market tomatoes sold in the US come from greenhouse, meaning 25% is from field, not all US. That could be Canada and Mexico as well, but they represent, the field represents 25% at most of fresh market tomatoes sold in the US. Almost none in the big box stores anymore, and very often it's regional in the groceries. Why? This is a quote from a big box store. Year-round production, food safety, and quality. We produce year-round as the industry. We have our food safety. We have an unfair advantage if you would. We're inside. It is a protected environment. And the quality, our contracts, anybody that's here a grower understands that our quality, our seconds are higher than many of the field, only because we don't have wind chafing and things like that that occur in the field, because we have a protected environment. Going to restate this again, but really quickly, 75% of fresh market comes from greenhouse and 25 field. These are all USDA numbers now. Field acres represent only 8% of US fresh retail sales. So the field growers represent 8% from Florida, and California is slightly less. There's a few more less acres of fresh market in California than there is in Florida. So I guess this is my point of saying, with this process pretty much starting from the Florida growers being excited about some tomatoes coming in from Mexico that had rugose on them going into grocery stores, we kind of have the tail wagging the dog here. And I have to point that out because the dog here, in this case, is the fresh market tomato retail sales from greenhouse. There's been a wave of challenges for our industry. I'm going to repeat these because I want everybody to understand the challenges we've gone through and how we've handled them. Clavibacter, about 1999, major challenge. It was coming in, it was seed-borne, seed-transmitted, much like some of the others we'll be talking about in a minute. Seed companies later on, and I think it was about 2007, they were able to start a program where good management, GSPP, which we'll talk about in a minute, that helped reduce this, and this has become a lesser issue. Pepino mosaic virus, it's another virus. It came in around 2000. Now this one I'm going to point out, and you're going to hear it over and over again, but Pepino mosaic virus is ubiquitous in our industry. It's in almost every greenhouse out there. And in fact, if it's not, some of the greenhouses, actually, there are registered products both in Canada and the US and Europe. It's a mild strain of pepino, so that if you do get it, you only get the mild conditions. And so I doubt there's a tomato in a greenhouse in a grocery store or a big box store that doesn't have pepino on it. It's extremely mechanically transmitted. It's just like the claims of rugose being, getting into retail sales is going to be a challenge for the field. This has been going on since, as I show here, 1999, and it's never been an issue in the field. We'll look in a minute why. Viroids came in about 2006, major issue related to potato spindle tuber viroid. And I think the last time we had seen this was about 2018, but phytosanitation and exclusion by the greenhouses made a major difference. Psyllids, believe it or not, the same beast that attacks the Florida citrus industry, greening, that's Candida liberibacter, started being an issue in about 2008. The psyllids come in, they carry this in their gut, they stop and feed on a tomato plant, and it stops production. Same challenges you have on citrus, only we're not a 40-year crop. We're an 8-year crop, 8-month crop, and maybe up to a year. And so while it is a major issue, and it's our number one pest right now, that if we get it, there's zero tolerance, we still don't have the challenges the citrus industry does with it. Agrobacterium rhizogenes, known as crazy root in the industry, started coming in about 2014. It was a bacterium that was found that would cause the roots to go nuts and high production. They would grow outside of the rockwool cubes and just literally looked like a mop at the bottom. I mean, all this sink, as the growers would say, was going into the root production and not into the fruit. It didn't destroy the crop, but it certainly decreased production because that's where the energy was going. And then finally, the rugose, so the tomato brown rugose fruit virus, came in 2018, and it was first reported in the U.S. Why impact on greenhouse? Well, a greenhouse costs $1 or $1.5 million per acre to build. It's a high-value crop. It's a monoculture. We'll go tomatoes followed by tomatoes followed by tomatoes or cucumbers the same way. When you get ready to plant a 40-acre greenhouse, especially on tomatoes, there's 450,000 plants that are going to get planted. Well, if it's $1 seed, that'd be $450,000, but it's not. We have a grafted, so we have two seeds there, one which may be $1 and one could be up to $4. So, and you doubled it, so you're now looking at 900,000 plants or 900,000 seeds, and so you're looking at spending $1 to $4 million. And I had a grower this week tell me that is a very conservative number for plants prior to ever planting. That's one of the reasons why it's devastating if an agency comes in and says you have to clean out a large-scale greenhouse because of the rugose virus. If you clean it out and you replace it tomorrow with another $1 to $4 million or more, you don't have a profit from that facility. Every plant is handled and touched 5 to 7 times per week. That's over 150 times per season. This is actually conservative. I'll run you through some more of those in a minute. Field has very limited number of touches. I put about 12, but it could be 14, 15, it could be 20. It wouldn't make any difference. Most of them are toward harvest, and none of them are enough to move the plants around in a field. It's believed that the rugose is not in the field. I believe it is in the field. I think if the greenhouse industry got it through seeds coming in, and you know the seed companies work very, very hard to get clean seeds into the greenhouse industry because we see it much easier than in the field. And because, with their higher priced seeds, it's been in the field. But the problem is it gets in a plant in the field, it stays there. It's not moved like it is in a greenhouse. And most of those were close to harvest, I said. Especially important when considering the mechanically transmitted disease like the rugose. And I talked a minute ago about the pepino being an example, but keep it in mind, it's exactly the same, mechanically transmitted, seed-borne, seed-transmitted, mildly transmitted, but it's the same thing, and it's never been shown to be a field issue, and it's been around for 20 years now. Quick threat analysis. Take a look at it. Remember, it's mechanically transmitted. Greenhouse, 5 to 7 touches, more than 150 per crop. Makes it a greenhouse disease more than a field disease, if it'll ever become a field disease. And it only takes one seed in a greenhouse to begin to spread. I don't think you can imagine that happening in the field. If you have one and it gets touched by a person who moves through the greenhouse, it has a good chance of going through that whole greenhouse before the season's out if the grower doesn't catch it. Pepino's the same way. Remember, we gave that as an example. The only reason I bring it up here again is it's on all the tomatoes. If you go to a grocery store and buy a greenhouse tomato, you're probably going to find pepino mosaic on it. Never been transferred to field production. I have a 99.7% story. Years and years ago, the seed companies would say, well, we're 99.97% clean of clavibacter. And that actually sounds really impressive to you. Think we just bought 1 million seeds, and that's 300 seeds that could potentially have clavibacter. I don't think that's what they meant, but that just means that it doesn't take much to mess you up. Unless seeds and phytosanitation that can be compromised by seed-transmitted disease are free from virus, it will and has got into greenhouses in the U.S. and I imagine Canada as well. And it moves by hand, shoulders, carts, clippers, and bumblebees. Nothing safe. Okay, let's look at some of the ways that it gets moved around. You know, there's a seed source. We've talked about that as being a potential issue, although I do believe the seed companies are working darn hard to make that change and being very careful. Propagators, those poor rascals get it early on when this was first coming in. They were getting seeds that had had the rugose in it. At planting, the seeds come in and we bring them in, we put them in the tray, and they're about half the size that they come in, and then we start training them. And when they train them, there's a string and we clip them on it. It goes up about 10 foot. If you've never been in a large scale greenhouse, this is about 10, this is about 7 or so weeks, I guess, into production. You're looking at 7 weeks of fruit hanging on here. But at the end of the year, you'll have a plant here that has been stripped of leaves and the vine will be going along here, and then suddenly the last 10 foot will look like this. So these plants can go 30 to 35 foot long before the season's over. And that's because at the top there's a bobbin with thread on it or string, and you can lower it down and move them over. So deleafing happens next. You can see where these were deleafed. These are all mechanically transmitted potentials. Harvesting, you go through and harvest the fruit off. You're lowering it, as I mentioned a minute ago. You're scouting. We have scouts go through once or twice a week. They're not just driving down and looking. They're counting cards. They're looking at the flowers at the top. They're doing both insect disease scouting, but they're also looking at the plants and whether or not the bees are working, to be honest with you. Crop protection, when we go through and spray, the equipment in the carrier has a chance of moving it along. And then finally, our beneficial placements. We use beneficials immensely in a greenhouse. Well, those cards are put in here are cachets, and for the beneficials to move around, and somebody's handling the plants to do it. And finally, our bumblebees. It's been shown that bumblebees can and will transmit the disease, pick it up, carry it back to the colony, and bring it back out again. Phytosanitation procedures. By the way, it looks like these are dirty suits. It just has to be a reflection off these walls. These are brand new. They just put them on. But it's intense monoculture. So what do? Phytosanitation. It starts with clean seed. We've talked about that. Then it goes into security, visitor pre-approved. If you were fortunate enough to sit on yesterday's presentation given by Kara McCready, she was talking about people coming back in, be very careful, and Tyvek up, suit, gloves, the whole bit. That's not just for us. That's also for the COVID-19 now. But most large-scale greenhouses still have no visitor policy. Nobody gets into them now because it's just the risk is too high. In-house procedures developed for Clavibacter, modified to be prepared for the tabemovirus. Worker area only assignment. Our workers are assigned to only certain areas in the greenhouse to work. They don't go all over the place. If they work these 5 rows, they live in those 5 rows. They don't go to the next 5. They use disinfectants and hand dip tools. They're dipping in between every one of the whether they're deleafing or harvesting or whatever. In between each one, they're either dropping it in, getting a clean tool, or they're dipping that tool in disinfectants. And a lot of the North America has been based on studies done in both OGVG, some of the researchers up there, but also Dr. Miller at Ohio State and Dr. Kai-Su Ling at USDA ran a study about 3 years ago. Miller did the fungal and bacterial properties and what worked for it, and Dr. Kai-Su Ling, USDA in Charleston did virus and viroid, and we use a lot of his studies, and he's repeating it now because what was found to work well or not work on other viruses, he's making sure what's best for the rugose. I mentioned some of the tools. You heard about Immunostrips. I threw this in for anybody that has never used one. It's a strip. You take a leaf or whatever, or a piece of tomato, whatever, you put it in this bag with a buffer already in it coming from Agdia. You cut the top off, you drop it in, you mesh it up so you get chlorophyll or plant material all through here. Then you drop the strip in, and it takes less than 30 minutes to get this answer. And it's much like in a pregnancy test. You get one line, and the test is working. You get 2 lines, and it's a positive. This is only for tobacco mosaic and tomato mosaic virus, but you can get a very weak red line across there, a cross reaction, if it happens to be the rugose or could be rugose. Everybody, I'm sure they're working hard now to come out with one that's specific for this, but this is what the USDA is currently using and calling positives. Phytosanitation procedures. Okay, we talked about it. It starts off with the seeds. We send it to labs we as a company send it to labs for testing. Every seed batch we get in, before it gets propagated, it goes to, in this case, CSP labs, but there's other certified labs like Iowa and others in the US. And then it goes to our greenhouse, but not before it's tested. I mentioned GSPP before, the Good Seed Plant Protection. It was created for Clavibacter, but one of the things it did, and the seed companies admit it helped them become better managers of their process. It's a good management tool, just like the GAP was, and good management practices were for agriculture in the U.S. for food safety. And so while it was directed for Clavibacter, it did give them a better management tool for managing other diseases that come in. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I don't expect you to read it, but this is a contract we have with our seed companies before they send it to us. This happens to be for tomato. We test for Clavibacter. We test for Propagation mosaic virus. We do viroids, and we also do we do the the tomato brown rugose and the tobacco mosaic, the Columella latent viroid. We do Ralstonia, and we do Agrobacterium rhizogenes. We've had positives over the years on Clavibacter, Pepino, and tobacco virus. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. By the way, here it is. In 2019, 3 seeds that were sent to us along to be tested while other seeds were sent to propagation and held so the tests are done, came in positive for the rugose between February 2019 and I believe it was June of 2019. So we tested them. The good news is none of these were used in production. The seeds were the seed companies get the data the same time we do, and so none of these got into our production practices. But just if you look at this, our seed tests are not statistically significant. We do a small number of seeds, and like I said, it doesn't take many to get through. So the seed companies really do have a tough job. They have to look at the whole batch, not just the small numbers, and that, I'm sure they're doing that, and that's I think why we haven't seen it since that period of time. Protocols on seed testing, we need a certified lab. Why? It was actually our sponsor today that years ago pointed out to us, if we're going to do this, at least use labs that are seed certified. So we did. We went to, and we've been using CSP at this point. We need somebody that gives a quick turnaround, and they do. They need to be able to handle seeds coming in from anywhere in the world, and they have that permits. They maintain an accessible database. I can log on now and look at the results. And even as they're in, they're testing for multiple things, as they finish up the various tests, it's on the database. Willing to automatically forward samples to secondary confirmation labs for presumptive positives. I want to point out here what happens is we consider the initial seed test a presumptive positive. They're getting positives, but I've asked that lab to relax their standards and go, and if they think it might have been positive or if it's close to being called a positive because of a range, we want them to call it a presumptive positive. We'd rather get a false positive than a false negative. If you think about that, a false positive, since we're sending it to the lab, they're going to take the time and find out. The first lab is getting a lot of seeds through, and we want to make sure that we get them back, and we don't want a false negative coming in. We'd rather have a false positive. And that confused them at first, but they got behind us on it. And then there's also criteria. They have to call the grower team with any presumptive positives at the lab, not just send an email. You're on vacation, you're traveling, you're giving a webinar, whatever. You don't get the email right away, but the call comes in. And they do that. And by the way, at the same time we get this data, the data goes directly to the seed company that was associated with that seed. It's transparent to them. So if it's secondary lab testing it, virus and viroids, as I mentioned, go to Dr. Ling in Charleston, South Carolina. He's also been one of our strongest advocates to try to come up with varieties and resistance, and he's running disinfectant studies now. Bacterial and fungal, go to Ohio State, Dr. Sally Miller's lab. She does those for us and any of the other folks. And if it turns out to be the rugose virus, since there is no good PCR or ELISA at this point, if it's a rugose, it then goes to a molecular cloning laboratory in San Francisco. Actually, at the same time, it goes to these sites, and it's tested for RNA sequencing. And short of what needs to be done next would be to take it and put it back and try to put it on a plant and show that it's viable. This is the only way that you can show that it is at least the tobacco virus, whether it's viable or not. And the seed companies get the results same time we do, and propagation is put on hold until confirmed by the second lab. I've mentioned CSP labs. I don't work for them. I don't get any cut from this, but we've worked with several out there, and they do a really good job. Iowa Seed Laboratory is the other one I know of that's out there doing a good job on this, that is certified. There's a lot of other really good labs. These are the two. This is the one that could give us a quick turnaround at this point. Okay, let's take a look at this coalition I mentioned in that earlier slide. Talking to APHIS as a single company and as companies going in and talk to them, APHIS had been approached by the field growers, which have an association and have a lot of backing. And so for me to go in to talk to APHIS, or for even some of the large growers in Canada go in and talk to APHIS as a U.S. representative, it doesn't carry weight. You have to have a coalition. So we did create a coalition. It's made up of companies that are both in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico that have a U.S. presence and are pretty much responsible for almost all of that 75% sales to companies in the U.S. So this formed fairly quickly because we all have the same problem. And the reason was to try to educate policymakers on the impact. For example, I don't think anybody bothered to tell APHIS the role of the greenhouse sales in the U.S. for fresh market versus field or non-Canadian or Mexican. So things like that and the science, that's been our job, and we've had the opportunity to get before APHIS multiple times. Some of the science behind this, behind the rugose, you saw a lot of it yesterday if you were on here with Kara, but what it comes up to, and I want to point out some things. One is mechanically transmitted viruses by point of purchase fruit to field tomato production has never been an issue. So mechanically transmitted virus at point of purchase, that's where you buy it as a customer, fruit, to field tomato production has never been an issue. Pepino has not been an issue. And so it's never been a challenge and it won't be a challenge for the field. Example, pepino, we've gone through this already. All greenhouses have it. You can go buy fruit at the store now and test it for pepino, and you'll probably find it on it. ToBRFV virus, which includes the rugose virus, has only been managed by plant resistance, not by exclusion or chemical treatment. If you think about it, there's only 3 tools that are out there for us to control plant diseases. I mean, one is exclusion, cultural, mechanical, all of the early parts of the IPM. Second would be chemical or biological, biological chemicals. And third is by resistance. Well, the ToBRFV viruses have never been managed by anything other than resistance. And the reason I point that out is that if you have a resistant gene and the fruit would still, if you have a resistant gene, let's say you had a resistant plant in Canada or Mexico, right now under this order, if you were to ship it into the U.S. At the border, it would still have the rugose on it, just wouldn't be any of the symptoms, and because it's resistant to it. So it would still have the potential of being kicked back at the border under this particular order because of the fruit inspections. Now, I mentioned before that Canada, before they were doing their, and they're putting together an order as well, and have had, they put out a risk assessment. I'm going to quote 2 things from their risk assessment that may be of interest. One is, quote, fresh fruit is generally, and they're talking about fruit inspected at the border or anywhere else, is generally considered a low-risk pathway for spread of the virus to greenhouse production systems. Only the U.S. regulates this pathway as an interim measure pending further risk assessment. And I pray that is an interim measure, that they do back off on this. I think political pressures are making it tough for them to do so at this point. To date, outbreaks of the rugose have been predominantly reported in protected cultivated environments, such as greenhouse or shade house, where it's handled the same as in a greenhouse. And so the risk assessment from Canada shows that fruit inspection and all that is not the way to go on this, but propagation and seed will be. Let's look at the federal order, and I'm repeating myself here some, but primarily among these include the development of both disease, tolerant, and resistant varieties. That's one of the tools we have. This has been a critical for other ToBRFV viruses. I mentioned a minute ago, the tobacco mosaic virus and the tomato mosaic virus. It's a TM22 gene. It didn't work for the rugose, but there is a gene out there now that's been developed in Israel. They're doing intellectual properties on it and protecting it. But I'm not real sure where the seed company's appetite is going to be to go out and pay a premium for this gene if it's going to get kicked back at a border because of a fruit inspection. Including fruit in any program is extremely costly, even devastating to our industry, as well as a handicap to agriculture in general. Tolerant and resistant varieties of crops permit the grower and industry to manage the disease, but even with the pathogen there, it's going to show up at the border in potential rejections. Unlike other ToBRFV virus that are currently have resistance, the inclusion of fruit inspection hampers this. And resistance is not just unique to tomatoes. It's all agriculture. Corn, soybean, tobacco, they all have resistant genes in it. Talk about some economic loss. Now, the first one I want to talk about here, between November 22nd and March 20th, these losses we're talking about losses at the distribution center that may have been in Canada, where you're shipping it to the border and shipping it back and offloading it, and the cost of border costs and all that, just for that short period, this period of time, just for that, not talking about the production, the cost of the fruit on the front end or the lost sales, was $750,000. And this is between November 22nd and March 20th. This happens to be almost all from Canada. Canada's in its lowest production at that point. This is the time of the year when they're down, but there was $750,000 lost there. If you go to southern border, one of the members of the coalition had, Company A rather. This one had nearly $400,000 in costs associated with fruit sent back by Customs and Border Patrol at both Ontario and British Columbia entry points. Another company, this one happens to be a southern border, had $258,000 of these kind of losses. The problem is, during this time, lost sales because of this exceeded $25 million for that coalition of the ones representing that 75% in the U.S. pretty much, and loss of customers. Our market is being eroded quickly because of this. This was due to the slow, and this was due during the slowest period of the year during the Canadian production. So we've warned aphids that we're kicking in now in a high production. I spent all weekend with border returns coming through, because right now Canada is going into high production, and as you can imagine, if it's been that bad before it got into high production, what's it going to be like now? This is the Blaine one. This is a story between November 22nd and January 1st, which is really early in the program. 30 truckloads of mixed Mexican and Canadian tomatoes were rejected at the border. Why Mexican and Canada? Because a lot of the distribution centers are in Canada, and they bring the fruit together, and Mexican fruit shipped up and mixed in with it and shipped down. 57% of the shipments that represents were kicked back between that period of time at that border. Central lab for testing. Now, when I say central lab, this is before Immunostrips were on site there. The Customs and Border Patrol would collect it, send the fruit. Well, actually, they collect fruit today, tomorrow, the next day. In fact, one case, it went from Wednesday to Sunday, and then they shipped it out overnight Sunday for a laboratory. Got it on Monday, and it was Wednesday before we got results back. You're looking at 8 days turnaround time. And you're talking about tomatoes that's already had shipments from Mexico up, been sitting in a warehouse for a few days. You're aging out. Shipper has to call the Customs and Border Patrol and try to get through, and it has taken multiple days to get through to them to receive that it's either released or rejected. Average cost at the Customs and Border Patrol, this is for Blaine, Washington. They bring the truck to the site. They make you offload the whole thing out on the tarmac. Don't even talk to me about food safety at this point. They inspect it, they pull samples, they put it back on and charge you on an average $722 to do that. That's on top of the shipping, the trailer, the cost of it. And so cost of customer loss and aging is enormous at this point. One example between January 4th and January 11th, 2019, 1 week example, the turnaround took 7 days, fruit aged out. Sales loss had already sold fruit at this point from this 1 week, one company was $93,000 already pre-sold, went back, plus the losses of the shipping and holding and everything else. It cost over $150,000 one company 1 week. And by the way, all 30 tests came back negative for rugose. Not a one of those were positive. Additional complications. Well, let's talk about this. It's at a distribution site. Its return truckload has to be offloaded because of long turnaround at that point. You can't keep it in a truck for 3 to 8 days. So it gets offloaded. And by the way, the customer no longer wants that same order 8 days later. They want different things. So it's a different mix. So if it's been tested at the border, Customs and Border Patrol put a seal on the truck. If you offload it, that seal gets broken. When you go back, it gets re-inspected again. And guess what? It's a catch-22. It goes through the same process over and over again. And that's because of the length of time at that point. Aphids has been receptive to trying to help on this. They have taken and started, after about 50 days, they were able to get Immunostrips into a couple of the ports. But I want to point out here, even with that, this weekend, Detroit, things are kicking up huge in Canadian shipments coming down now. APHIS did not have any inspector for due Immunostrips from Friday night at 3 o'clock until Monday morning at 8. So anything it came across on a very busy weekend that got inspected got kicked back. Nothing could get through because there was no inspector there to do the immunostrip to try to put it through until Monday, and then all of them were done Monday and Tuesday, and it took almost 2 days for them to catch up. So right now, if you want to ship through Detroit to Buffalo, you better ship between that shipment going in between 8 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday only. Recap. One is the greatest challenge is the greenhouses. Seed and propagation is the part of the solution and the challenge there. History tells us that fruit at point of sale with plant pathogens is not a source for mechanical transmission to field or other greenhouse. This is not a food safety issue, with one exception. I did tell you that the Customs and Border Patrol are offloading and putting it on the tarmac and inspecting it and putting it back on. We have no control over food safety at that point. In fact, I don't know any of you folks may be involved in food safety, but if you're familiar with the adulteration clause under the FDA's program, adulteration means that anything you do to the fruit that isn't part of the fruit or shouldn't be there is considered adulteration. Multiple times, Customs and Border Patrol, when they see something like this, they're going to send it back. They take a spray paint, run down the side of the pallet, and that paint gets all over the tomatoes. That is intentional adulteration by definition. Greenhouse industry has had to deal with multiple mechanical diseases, and we've dealt with those. Until seeds and propagation are free, it will get into US, Mexico, Canada, and other sites. It only takes one plant. Phytosanitation procedures have been part of the greenhouse production for over 15 years, and we know how to deal with it. Industry is integrated across North American borders, and fruit inspection is contrary to a standard agricultural resistance for variety disease control. It absolutely, and US, I believe, was the only country that had done that ever. I do believe it's politically motivated, and I don't just believe it. I know that was where it started, but it needs to come off. And then finally, I thank you for this opportunity. I have had 4 minutes left in my 45 minutes, and I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator just fine and see if there's any questions.
Oh yes, there definitely are questions. And
Uh-oh.
to the audience, if you still have questions, be sure to send them in. We have a question about what happens at the border. So what does that process look like when border inspections are made? Are they just looking at visual symptoms first, or how does that work?
Yeah, at a border, what they do is, and I'll talk about Blaine first because that's one I've seen most of, but also Detroit. I know in Blaine what they do is they take it down to the border. Blaine being British Columbia's border. They take it to the border. They offload the entire shipment. They go through and look at it, and they pull samples at that point, and then they put the shipment back on at a reasonable cost of $722 back on the truck, and then the Customs and Border Patrol put a seal on it. They have a seal. It looks like kind of like a bungee cord that goes across it. They crimp it, and they put a number on it. It then goes back to the distribution center. And if you can wait until the results, if it happens to be between 8 o'clock and 3 o'clock on a Friday, Monday to Friday, and you can get results back pretty quick, they'll turn you around while you're still in transit. They do kick you back across the border. There is just not enough room at the ports to leave the trucks there. They're basically kicking them back. Now, I don't know that's happened to all trucks, but I know it's happened to almost every truck that I know about that's gone across, and that's because they just don't have enough room for it there. Does that help?
So the time that they're waiting for the lab test results to come back?
Well, it's called a lab test, but it's basically an immunostrip. And so when we were early on in the program, we had a lot of conversations with APHIS and said, look, if you're going to wait 8 days to send it to a lab down in Seattle and get a result back, and all it is a immunostrip, get somebody up there to do it on the site. Make it an hour or an hour and a half turnaround. So after 50 days of the federal order, APHIS did get somebody to do it in Blaine, Washington. And then APHIS had finally put somebody into Detroit after that, not immediately, to do the same thing, but they're only doing it, at least this weekend, they're only doing it, they didn't do it over the weekend at all, which I can tell you there were a lot of shipments trying to get across this weekend, and they're only doing it Monday through Friday, 8 to 3. Otherwise, it gets held. That sample gets held to that following Monday, where it then gets tested, and you get your results back sometimes on Tuesday.
Okay, so do they only test the sample if it visually looks like it could have the rugose?
Yeah, that is the premise, and I believe that is true. But what happens is we've had fruit turned back because it's a TOV with a green tail. We've had fruit turned back because it's in a medley, and some of those are darker fruit, some are yellow, some are orange. We've had fruit turned back because it was an heirloom, or some folks refer to ugly fruit. None of it really, well, as far as we know, none of it has been due to a rugose. They are getting, they said out of Detroit they've had some presumptive positives with the Immunostrip, but none of it's confirmed. And but yes, they do look for something that's irregular, then they sample it.
Okay. So you were talking earlier about trying to breed a resistant tomato. So I guess theoretically, if the resistant tomato didn't exhibit any symptoms, would it not be tested for rugose?
Well, theoretically that is entirely possible, but exception of if you're going in and it's a green tail fruit again, or it's any of the things I just identified, those weren't symptoms of rugose. In fact, you can't tell rugose. According to USDA ARS, you cannot tell rugose, and this is also UC California, Davis, by symptomology at a border or any other crossing. It looks too much like pepino, or in many of these cases, just not enough training in terms of what the various varieties of fruits look like and what they tomato fruit and what they look like at different stages of being picking. You know, we pick anywhere from a stage 3 to a 6 or whatever, depending on how far it has to ship, and all those things. Customs and Border Patrol trying to do what they can, but there has been a challenge.
So consistency is likely an issue as well.
Absolutely. You've heard me say it over and over. It doesn't belong in there in the first place, but I don't think right now it's going to go away.
So then in terms of propagation material, is that tested regardless of what they look like?
Well, the propagation material, because of the federal order, have to get a phytosanitation certificate before they ship it into the U.S. Because live plants coming into the U.S. from Canada can come in without being bare rooted. I believe Mexico's that way now too. Other locations, plants coming in have to be bare rooted, and so they have to have a phytosanitation. So CFIA was doing that pretty much with propagators already, and especially if they were shipping into California, which had some of those requirements coming in for a long time before rugose. So that industry was able to have phytosanitation certificates from CFIA coming in fairly quickly, and there's not as much shipment as you can imagine on propagated material as there is daily shipments of tomatoes coming across. CFIA and the Mexican government just don't have time to do all those shipments and give a phyto certificate.
So there was one case you mentioned where it was a mixed load of Canadian and Mexican tomatoes, I believe.
Yes.
How did they manage to get tomatoes from two different countries to the same distribution center to begin with?
Well, if you look at this, it was late November, early December, sometime in that, where Canada is going out of production. During that time, many of the distribution centers for distribution up in the Northeast and even over in the Leamington to the Northeast quarter of the U.S. and the Northwest quarter of the U.S., the distribution centers are either going to be in Saddle or across the border in Surrey or in the West Coast or Leamington on the East Coast. So the DCs were set up prior to this challenge, not necessarily in the U.S. side. They were set up on the Canadian side where they would do the mixtures, get the order out for the customers and ship it down, which worked really well until this order came on.
Gotcha. We have one question, and they're asking how much of the rejections at the ports of entry do you think is politically motivated?
Well, I don't know that any of them are being rejected. The rejections are politically motivated. The Customs and Border Patrol is trying to do their job right. APHIS is trying to do what they've been directed to do by putting together this order. Having the fruit on the order is what was politically motivated. It's never been done before. It's suddenly on this one. order coming out in 7 days. And so, and it was actually, it started with Florida growers going to their commissioner of ag, who went to USDA, and they have had a very powerful and voice over the years. The problem is they only represent 8% of the sales, but they have a very powerful voice and have been very effective, if I can,
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question asking if the rugose has been declared a quarantinable disease in US or Canada.
I should have looked this up ahead of time to get the correct answer. I believe it's considered, and if Kara was on here, she'd probably correct me on it. There's a term for it that refers that it is quarantinable in the U.S.
We can always
and I
follow up
can't
on
answer
this
that question for you. Yeah, I can get back on that for you. But it's considered quarantine and it's being inspected. Like I said, right now in the U.S., no, in the U.S., it's gotten into the U.S. and it's in the press. It's been publicated. I just don't know that. It's the old statement. I don't know how many of you guys know the statement, but you can't close the door you can't close the barn door after the horse is out. And that's kind of the situation here.
Gotcha. Okay, we can always follow up on these. Another question was about molecular diagnostics. Do we have a sense of how accurate they are?
Yeah, let me explain to it real quick how that works. The rugose gene is about 6,000 amino acid string long. What they do is they'll do a test and they'll take a piece of that RNA and they'll amplify it over and over and over again so it can be enough to be tested. But it's just a piece of that string. It may be 100 amino acids. That is then taken to a molecular lab where they test it. And if that string exactly matches up with anywhere along that 6,000, it's considered a 100% match because there's that much uniqueness to it. So that's, as I understand it, how the RNA molecular is done. They don't do a whole genome. You hear about this whole genome sequencing. They're doing a piece of it, but that is right now what's considered 100%.
Okay. And is there any chance that it could be mixed up with a different similar tobamovirus?
Don't think so. But I'm out of my league on this one. I just know how the test is done. It took me a while. I think it was Dr. Ling gave me an education in that one because I had not done a lot of molecular testing before this because PCR is effective in most of them. And but in this particular case, because it came on so quick, there was no good PCR. I believe there are some probably getting ready to be effective now. I know that there's some they call LAMP assays that are I think UC Davis is developing, which will all speed this up in the future.
Sort of along the same lines of questioning, there's a question about how accurate the immunoassays are.
With the immunoassays, you're talking about the Immunostrips. If you ask AgDia, they consider it fairly high for what it's for, the tobacco mosaic virus and the tomato mosaic virus. We've had false positives on it in the field where we use them, but it's a great indicator for those. It was never indicated or was never designed for the for the tomato brown rugose fruit virus. But because it did give a mild reaction to it, it at least gave a tool better than waiting 14 to 15 days to get an RNA sequence, which you can't do on tomatoes. Don't think it's the right way. I don't think it shouldn't even be. It shouldn't have been a tool, but it sure beats the fact of them kicking back produce that didn't even come positive with that for months. And that was the tool they're using. When the USDA talks about a lab assay, that's what they use. I believe they're doing some confirmations now, but at the time they weren't.
Switching gears just a little bit, we have a question about whether or not greenhouse growers allow their workers to bring tomatoes in their lunches.
Well, I can't speak for all growers, but I know we don't. Early on, if a grower wanted tomatoes for their lunch or peppers, we just said, we'll supply them to you. Do not bring them in. Do not bring anything that has not been cooked or processed like that into our facilities. And yes, it is an issue. If I was a field, I wouldn't worry as much about it because they're not going to touch all the plants like they do in ours. But in the greenhouse, it would have been a way of bringing it in. And so we did shut that off fairly early. So no tomatoes or peppers from outside come in
Hmm.
at our facilities.
Got it. So going forward, collectively, what would you say that we could do as an industry?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, that's why we formed the coalition. As I mentioned, I had an opportunity to talk to folks at APHIS early on, and they said, Mike, you've got a good story. We know you have some issues, but you're one group, you're one person, or one company, and you're up against an association, if you would. So that's why we formed this U.S. Greenhouse Coalition, USGHC, which is made up of all, if not, all the major companies in the U.S. and most of them have major holdings in Canada and in Mexico as well. And we actually went outside and hired a lobbyist group to work with us that had already been working with the USDA APHIS in the past. So that has been formed. We're always, if anybody has an interest in finding out more about that coalition, whatever, the lobbyists or the outside association we're using in Washington D.C. is a group called the Russell Group, RUSSELL group, and you can contact them directly and talk to them about it. Or and that's probably the best way at this point because they're serving as our focal point.
Mm-hmm.
We've had multiple calls though with APHIS with them in tow. We have another one coming up sometime in the next week where APHIS has said that they would bring in Customs and Border Patrol and the APHIS assistant administrator, I think it is, for PPQ to be on the line to talk about some of the problems. But again, the problems are all putting food on this order. It should not have been there. And this is a world according to Bledsoe. I say that over and over again, but it should never have been on there. And the Canadian CFIA agree with it, as do every other country.
Mm-hmm. What advice would you give a producer in that situation? They're at the border, and they're just waiting.
Well, if it's Detroit or Blaine and it's during the week, you're between 8 and 3 in the afternoon. There's a pretty good chance that those two borders, Blaine being BC and Detroit, obviously Leamington, you have a pretty good chance that they're going to be able, if they're going to pull a sample, there's a pretty good chance they're going to walk it in. USDA is going to run the sample, and the challenge is getting through. For the longest time, even the phone numbers on the paper they gave you is called an EAN, Emergency Action Notice. The phone numbers, they would roll over, go busy, or you couldn't get through. It is getting better now, but I keep asking for this to be transparent and put online or accessible. It's not. It can take you a day or more to get through to these folks. And that's because there's a lot of folks trying to get across and there's only one line.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I tell you? If it's during the day, during that period of time when you know there's somebody there doing the inspection from USDA, do not offload. They're going to kick you back across the border because there's probably not enough place there for you to park. But don't offload. Go back and keep calling and trying to get the results. The moment you get it, you can turn the truck back because that seal they put on it has an identifier, and that'll allow the truck to go back through.
Mm-hmm. And then in the case where it is rejected, what is a producer's options?
Well, if it's rejected and it's before they say it's a presumptive positive, you're not going to be able to bring it back across the border. It's the U.S. has told you it doesn't belong there, and it's illegal to do so. So what happens is you then the only other option is selling it for I always say pennies on a dollar, but you're going into markets that's already not the major market, and it's local markets or other Canadian markets or Mexican markets. It happens to be Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
But you really can't come into the U.S. with that at that point. Okay. And there's stories about what to do with it, but you're going to have a way to try to find local markets with it because you're not going to be able to bring it back in.
Mm-hmm. And then you also mentioned how there was a bit of a food safety issue.
Right. And the problem is Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, what do you do with that after
Well,
it's been handled differently? There's paint on it.
Well, if it's got paint on it, you can't use it, and that's an intentional adulteration, which is against the law. But Customs and Border Patrol, those guys carry guns and badges, so they pretty much do what they want to do. But for us, it would be considered adulteration. It goes back across the border. If it's been sprayed like that, um, actually, I've always said that you really messed with the Customs and Border Patrol because he was really excited. But if it comes back positive, you're in bad shape. You're screwed because you can't bring it back now. So those are not going to be accessible. If that happens to a load and it's on a truck, your customers aren't going to accept that. So you really have lost that load and any opportunity to ever bring it back.
Oh, so, but who would be responsible for that loss then?
Well, if you read the EANs, it says that they're not responsible for any of the actions or costs. And so
Right.
Customs and Border Patrol, somebody, in fact, that's all I've seen them where they have magic markers on the side. So it didn't get on the tomatoes, but you can't ship those boxes. No customer's going to want that. But early on, they were taking green paint and just spraying up the side of the box, up and down. And the problem is, if you've ever gone across the border, whether you're in a car or in a truck, you can't have your phone, you can't take pictures. Half the time you're not even permitted to watch the process. We've been told by APHIS now to request to be able to have the truck sit there and watch it. But those guys are total control. There's not much you can do about it.
Well, on that note.
And remember, APHIS has turned it over to them. So, yeah, I know. Like I said, they got the guns and badges.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to say that that's all the time we have for today. Hopefully we can do a follow-up in a few weeks, but thank you to Mike for sharing his experience with us. And thank you to DeRuiter for making this webinar series possible. To our audience, thank you for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll post the answers online on our website in a few days, and a recording of this presentation will be made available online later this week. A direct link will be sent to everyone who registered. Thank you again, and bye for now.
Thank you very much.